Tuesday, 22 June 1941. Had Germany already lost the war before it truly understood the problem it had created? At dawn on that summer morning, as German artillery opened fire along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the decision to invade the Soviet Union revealed not only ambition but a fatal contradiction. The problem was not simply that the war would expand. It was that Germany had already committed itself to a struggle it could not economically, demographically, or industrially sustain. Long before Allied troops crossed into Germany in 1945, the foundations of defeat were already in place, hidden beneath early victories and the illusion of momentum that masked deeper structural weaknesses. Germany entered World War II with a military doctrine built on speed, concentration of force, and short campaigns designed to avoid prolonged economic strain. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactical preference but a strategic necessity, shaped by limited access to raw materials, dependence on imported oil, and a civilian economy not fully mobilized for total war until years after fighting began. Early successes in Poland and Western Europe appeared to validate this approach, but they also encouraged strategic overreach. Each victory postponed a reckoning rather than preventing it, as Germany failed to translate battlefield success into a sustainable long-term position. The invasion of France in 1940 is often remembered as evidence of German military superiority, yet it also concealed emerging problems. Britain remained unconquered, Germany's navy was inadequate to challenge British sea power, and the air campaign against the Royal Air Force failed to secure air superiority. This left Germany engaged in a war it could not decisively end in the West, forcing continued resource allocation to defensive preparations along the Atlantic while simultaneously planning expansion eastward. The inability to eliminate Britain as an active opponent ensured that Germany would eventually face a multi-front war, a scenario its leadership understood historically to be disastrous. Economic realities further undermined Germany's position. Despite impressive early production figures, the German economy lacked the capacity for sustained output compared to its potential enemies. The United States and the Soviet Union possessed vastly greater industrial depth, access to raw materials, and labor reserves. Germany relied heavily on synthetic substitutes for fuel and rubber, processes that were expensive, energy-intensive, and vulnerable to disruption. These limitations meant that Germany's war effort was balanced on a narrow margin, where losses could not be easily replaced and disruptions cascaded into systemic weakness. The decision to delay full economic mobilization reflected both ideological and political considerations. Nazi leadership feared civilian morale collapse if living standards declined too sharply, choosing instead to pursue a war that appeared distant and manageable. This miscalculation allowed Germany's enemies time to mobilize their own economies on a scale Germany could never match. By the time German industry shifted fully toward war production, the gap was already widening beyond recovery. Operation Barbarossa exposed these vulnerabilities more starkly than any previous campaign. The invasion was conceived as a short, decisive blow that would collapse Soviet resistance within months. Planning assumptions underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and ability to adapt under extreme pressure. German logistics were stretched across immense distances, dependent on inadequate road networks and incompatible rail systems. Fuel shortages became chronic, and equipment losses mounted faster than replacements could be produced. The ideological framing of the war in the East compounded these practical problems. The invasion was not merely military but ideological, shaping policies that alienated potential local support and fueled resistance. Occupation practices prioritized exploitation over stabilization, undermining any possibility of reducing the burden on German forces. Instead of a rapid collapse, Germany encountered a protracted war of attrition, the very scenario its strategic doctrine was designed to avoid. Winter 1940 marked a turning point not because Germany was defeated outright, but because the illusion of inevitability was shattered. The failure to capture Moscow, combined with mounting casualties and equipment losses, revealed that the war would continue indefinitely. From that moment, Germany faced an inescapable arithmetic problem. Its enemies could absorb losses and replace them, while Germany could not do so at the same rate. The entry of the United States into the war further sealed this imbalance. American industrial output dwarfed that of Germany, and its geographic position insulated it from direct attack. The combined industrial capacity of the Allied powers transformed the conflict into a production war, where tanks, aircraft, ships, and fuel flowed in quantities Germany could never equal. Even before American forces engaged in large-scale combat, the material balance had shifted decisively. Strategic bombing intensified these pressures. Allied air campaigns targeted Germany's industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, and synthetic fuel facilities. While German production proved resilient in the short term, the cumulative effect was devastating. Disruptions forced inefficient dispersal of factories, increased reliance on forced labor, and diverted resources toward air defense rather than offensive capability. Each adjustment reduced overall efficiency, deepening the structural deficit. Germany's leadership structure exacerbated these challenges. Decision-making was fragmented, with overlapping authorities and competition among institutions. Strategic coherence suffered as political considerations distorted military priorities. The absence of a unified economic command delayed rational allocation of resources, while ideological loyalty often outweighed competence in leadership appointments. These internal dynamics ensured that Germany could not respond effectively to changing conditions. The war at sea illustrated another long-term problem. Germany lacked the naval strength to challenge Allied control of global trade routes. While U-boat campaigns initially inflicted heavy losses, technological adaptation by the Allies eventually neutralized this threat. Once the Atlantic was secured, the Allies enjoyed uninterrupted access to global resources, further widening the economic gap. Germany, by contrast, remained increasingly isolated and dependent on shrinking sources of supply. By 1943, the cumulative effects of these factors were undeniable. The defeat at Stalingrad symbolized more than a battlefield loss. It marked the irreversible erosion of Germany's strategic initiative. Casualties reached levels that strained manpower reserves, forcing reliance on younger and older conscripts and reducing overall combat effectiveness. Training standards declined, and experienced personnel became irreplaceable losses. Meanwhile, Allied coordination improved steadily. Shared intelligence, combined planning, and standardized production amplified their collective strength. Germany faced not isolated opponents but an integrated coalition capable of applying pressure across multiple domains simultaneously. Each new front further diluted Germany's capacity to concentrate force, undermining the core principle of its early successes. The question of when Germany lost the war thus extends beyond specific battles. It lies in the intersection of strategic overreach, economic limitation, ideological rigidity, and structural inefficiency. These elements were present long before 1945, shaping outcomes regardless of tactical brilliance or individual acts of resistance. Once Germany committed itself to a prolonged, multi-front conflict against materially superior opponents, the trajectory toward defeat was set. Understanding this process requires moving beyond dramatic endpoints to examine underlying systems. Wars are not decided solely by final offensives, but by sustained capacity to adapt, produce, and endure. Germany's failure was not inevitable in a deterministic sense, but it became increasingly probable as choices accumulated and constraints tightened. The persistence of fighting until 1945 reflected not strength but inertia. The regime's control mechanisms suppressed dissent and delayed collapse, even as military defeat became unavoidable. This prolonged resistance increased destruction and suffering without altering the fundamental imbalance. By the time Allied forces advanced into Germany, the outcome had long ceased to be in doubt. From an educational perspective, this history illustrates how early decisions shape long-term outcomes. Strategic assumptions, economic planning, and ideological priorities interact over time, creating paths that become difficult to reverse. Germany's experience in World War II demonstrates that initial success can conceal fatal weaknesses, and that momentum, once lost, is rarely regained against superior resources. The war also underscores the importance of coalition dynamics. No single Allied nation possessed all the necessary elements for victory alone, but together they created a system capable of sustained pressure. Germany's failure to prevent this alignment and its underestimation of opponents' capacity to cooperate proved decisive. Examining Germany's trajectory invites reflection on broader questions of power and limitation. Military effectiveness depends not only on weapons and tactics, but on economic resilience, social cohesion, and institutional adaptability. When these elements are misaligned, even formidable forces can be undermined from within. The belief that Germany might have won if different tactical decisions had been made overlooks the cumulative weight of structural constraints. Adjustments at the margins could not overcome fundamental disparities in resources and production. Once the war became global and prolonged, Germany's margin for maneuver vanished. This perspective does not diminish the complexity of events or the contingency inherent in history. Rather, it situates individual moments within a larger framework, emphasizing processes over isolated outcomes. Germany's defeat was the result of interacting forces that unfolded over years, not a single turning point. The deeper layers of Germany's predicament become even clearer when examining how its leadership interpreted early victories. Success in Poland and France reinforced a culture of overconfidence that discouraged critical reassessment. Instead of consolidating gains and addressing economic vulnerabilities, German leadership doubled down on expansion, believing that each conquest would solve resource shortages. In reality, every new territory required occupation forces, administrative structures, and security measures that drained manpower and material. The contradiction was that conquest, intended to secure resources, consumed resources at an accelerating rate. The logistical system underpinning German operations was another hidden fault line. Germany lacked a fully motorized army, relying heavily on horse-drawn transport well into the war. While armored spearheads captured headlines, the majority of the Wehrmacht moved at speeds closer to those of World War I. This created a dual-speed force that complicated supply chains and limited operational flexibility. As campaigns extended deeper into enemy territory, supply lines stretched beyond sustainable limits, and logistical inefficiencies became operational constraints rather than administrative inconveniences. Rail infrastructure posed additional challenges. German rail systems were efficient within Germany and Western Europe, but incompatible with the Soviet broad-gauge system. Converting tracks required time, labor, and materials that Germany could ill afford during a rapid campaign. Delays in rail conversion meant that frontline units often outpaced their supplies, leading to fuel shortages, ammunition deficits, and maintenance backlogs. These issues were not merely tactical setbacks, but systemic limitations that no battlefield brilliance could overcome. Germany's scientific and technological capabilities were advanced in many areas, but innovation alone could not compensate for industrial scale. Projects such as jet aircraft, rockets, and advanced submarines consumed enormous resources while delivering limited immediate impact. These programs reflected a search for technological miracles that could offset numerical inferiority, yet they diverted skilled labor and materials from more practical production. The focus on wonder weapons illustrates how strategic desperation can distort priorities, investing in breakthroughs that arrive too late to alter the broader balance. Manpower constraints also shaped Germany's trajectory. Demographic realities meant that Germany had fewer potential soldiers than its major adversaries. Losses on the Eastern Front were catastrophic, and replacement systems could not maintain quality. Training periods shortened, and units were filled with increasingly inexperienced recruits. As veteran soldiers were killed or wounded, institutional knowledge eroded, reducing tactical effectiveness and increasing casualty rates in a feedback loop that accelerated decline. The ideological nature of the Nazi state further compounded these issues. Racial policies eliminated or marginalized large segments of the population that could have contributed to the war effort. Scientists, engineers, and skilled workers were persecuted or murdered, depriving Germany of human capital at a time when every expert was valuable. Forced labor systems provided manpower, but at the cost of efficiency, sabotage, and moral degradation, undermining productivity and cohesion. Germany's alliance structure was another structural weakness. While the Axis included several nations, coordination was limited, and mutual support was inconsistent. Italy, Hungary, Romania, and others provided troops and resources, but their industrial and military capabilities were far below those of the major Allied powers. Strategic disagreements and operational failures among Axis partners further diluted Germany's efforts, forcing German forces to compensate for Allies' weaknesses rather than benefiting from genuine coalition strength. In contrast, the Allied powers developed increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for coordination. Combined chiefs of staff, joint production planning, and shared intelligence created a level of integration unprecedented in earlier conflicts. This allowed the Allies to allocate resources efficiently, avoid duplication, and exploit comparative advantages. Germany faced a coalition whose total capacity exceeded the sum of its parts, while Germany's own system suffered from fragmentation and rivalry. Germany's political system discouraged honest assessment and dissent. Leaders feared delivering bad news, and critical analysis was often interpreted as disloyalty. This created an information environment in which optimism was rewarded and realism punished. As a result, strategic decisions were made based on distorted data and wishful thinking. The absence of corrective feedback mechanisms allowed flawed strategies to persist long after evidence of failure was clear. The home front represented another arena where early decisions had long-term consequences. The regime sought to maintain civilian morale by delaying austerity measures, but this postponed necessary economic mobilization. Consumer goods production continued at levels that were unsustainable in a total war, and only later did Germany shift to full wartime production. By that time, Allied economies had already surged ahead, and Germany's late mobilization could not close the gap. The role of occupied Europe also reveals contradictions. While Germany extracted resources and labor from conquered territories, occupation policies generated resistance movements that tied down large numbers of troops. Rail sabotage, partisan warfare, and intelligence leaks forced Germany to divert divisions from the front lines. The exploitation that fueled Germany's war economy simultaneously undermined its military capacity, illustrating how coercion can create strategic liabilities. Energy shortages were a constant constraint. Germany lacked domestic oil reserves and depended on imports from Romania and synthetic fuel plants. These sources were vulnerable to disruption, and Allied bombing campaigns targeted refineries and transportation networks. As fuel became scarce, training hours for pilots decreased, armored operations were curtailed, and strategic mobility suffered. Modern mechanized warfare depended on fuel, and Germany's chronic shortages placed it at a permanent disadvantage. The Mediterranean theater further strained Germany's resources. Campaigns in North Africa, the Balkans, and Italy diverted troops and equipment from the decisive Eastern Front. While these operations achieved some successes, they also opened additional fronts that Germany had to defend. Each new commitment reduced the ability to concentrate forces, eroding the strategic principle that had driven early victories. By the time Allied forces invaded Normandy in 1944, Germany's capacity to respond effectively was severely degraded. The Western Front reopened, while the Eastern Front remained a massive drain on resources. Strategic reserves were limited, transportation networks were damaged, and air superiority had shifted decisively to the Allies. The outcome of the invasion was influenced not only by the battle itself, but by years of accumulated strategic and economic disadvantages. The persistence of resistance within Germany, even as defeat became inevitable, reflects the nature of authoritarian systems. Control mechanisms, propaganda, and fear delayed internal collapse, prolonging the conflict. This delay increased civilian casualties, destruction of infrastructure, and human suffering across Europe. It also demonstrates how political structures influence the duration and intensity of wars beyond purely military considerations. From a methodological standpoint, historians analyze Germany's defeat through multiple lenses: military strategy, economic capacity, political structure, and social dynamics. Each lens reveals different aspects of the same underlying process, highlighting the interconnectedness of modern warfare. No single factor determined the outcome. Rather, it was the interaction of constraints and decisions over time that shaped the trajectory. This integrated approach challenges simplified narratives that attribute Germany's loss to specific battles or individual mistakes. While tactical errors mattered, they occurred within a broader framework that limited possible outcomes. Understanding these constraints provides a more nuanced view of how wars are won and lost, emphasizing systemic factors over dramatic turning points. Germany's experience in World War II thus serves as a foundational case study in strategic overstretch. It illustrates how ambitions that exceed material and organizational capacity can create self-reinforcing cycles of failure. Each attempt to solve one problem generated additional problems, and each expansion created new vulnerabilities that opponents could exploit. The educational value of this history lies in its relevance to contemporary discussions of power, strategy, and governance. It shows that military strength cannot be separated from economic and political foundations, and that early decisions can lock systems into trajectories that are difficult to reverse. It also demonstrates that victory depends not only on battlefield performance, but on sustained capacity across multiple domains. By tracing these patterns, the question of when Germany lost the war becomes less about pinpointing a single date and more about recognizing a process. That process began when Germany chose a path that demanded more than its system could deliver, and continued as opportunities for correction were missed or rejected. The final collapse was the visible endpoint of a long structural decline that unfolded beneath the surface of daily operations and headlines. Another dimension often overlooked is the role of time as an adversary Germany could not defeat. Every month the war continued favored the Allies, whose economies expanded while Germany's contracted under pressure. Industrial plants in the United States multiplied output year after year, while Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals, increased production despite devastation in occupied territories. Germany, by contrast, fought against the clock, with each delay amplifying shortages and eroding advantages that had once compensated for numerical inferiority. The transformation of the Soviet Union from a victim of surprise invasion into an industrial and military juggernaut illustrates this dynamic clearly. Early German assumptions rested on the belief that Soviet industry was backward and centrally brittle. In reality, the Soviet state demonstrated extraordinary capacity for adaptation, evacuating thousands of factories, mobilizing labor on an unprecedented scale, and simplifying production to maximize output. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft rolled off assembly lines in quantities Germany could not match, turning the Eastern Front into a contest of endurance rather than maneuver. Germany's intelligence failures also contributed to its long-term disadvantage. Pre-war assessments underestimated the resilience of adversaries and overestimated the effectiveness of German intimidation. Intelligence that contradicted optimistic assumptions was often ignored or suppressed, reinforcing strategic blind spots. This pattern persisted throughout the war, as warning signs of Allied capabilities were discounted until they manifested as overwhelming force on the battlefield. The structure of the German armed forces further reflected these systemic issues. While tactical excellence remained high in many units, coordination between branches suffered. Rivalries between the Army, Navy, and Air Force impeded joint planning and resource allocation. Air power was frequently misused for tactical support at the expense of strategic priorities, while naval ambitions exceeded realistic capabilities. These institutional frictions diluted Germany's ability to leverage its strengths coherently. Air superiority became another decisive factor long before Allied troops reached German borders. The attrition of the Luftwaffe in prolonged campaigns, combined with fuel shortages and pilot training limitations, eroded its effectiveness. As Allied air forces gained control of the skies, they not only disrupted production but also constrained movement, logistics, and morale. The loss of air superiority magnified every other weakness, transforming operational challenges into insurmountable obstacles. Civilian morale within Germany also evolved over time in ways that reflected underlying realities. Initial enthusiasm gave way to fatigue as bombing intensified and living conditions deteriorated. While repression limited overt dissent, the psychological toll of sustained hardship undermined productivity and social cohesion. The regime's efforts to maintain an image of control could not fully conceal the growing gap between propaganda and lived experience. Germany's approach to occupied territories increasingly revealed strategic short-sightedness. Rather than integrating these regions into a cooperative economic system, policies emphasized extraction and punishment. This approach not only reduced productivity but fueled resistance movements that became increasingly effective as Allied support expanded. The cost of suppressing resistance further strained manpower and resources, turning occupation into a net liability. The interplay between military setbacks and political rigidity became more pronounced as the war progressed. Opportunities for negotiated settlement diminished as the regime doubled down on ideological objectives. This inflexibility ensured that defeat, when it came, would be total rather than partial. By rejecting compromise, Germany foreclosed paths that might have reduced destruction, binding itself to an all-or-nothing outcome. The escalation of total war also altered the character of German society. Mobilization reached deeper into civilian life, conscripting labor and redirecting education and industry toward survival rather than progress. These measures extended the war effort but could not reverse the fundamental imbalance. Instead, they revealed the limits of coercion as a substitute for sustainable capacity. From a comparative perspective, Germany's experience contrasts sharply with that of its opponents. Allied societies, despite internal differences, proved capable of absorbing strain while maintaining legitimacy and adaptability. Democratic institutions facilitated debate and correction, allowing strategies to evolve in response to evidence. Germany's authoritarian system, by contrast, prioritized loyalty over accuracy, reducing its ability to learn from failure. The cumulative effect of these dynamics was the erosion of strategic choice. As options narrowed, Germany reacted to events rather than shaping them. Defensive measures replaced initiative, and improvisation substituted for planning. This shift marked the transition from a power capable of decisive action to one trapped by circumstances largely of its own making. The war's final phases thus reflected outcomes that had been implicit for years. Military collapse followed economic exhaustion, political isolation, and social strain. The battlefield defeats of 1944 and 1945 were dramatic, but they were expressions of a deeper process that had long since reached critical mass. For scholars and students of history, this progression underscores the importance of examining causation across multiple levels. Tactical brilliance and individual leadership matter, but they operate within structural frameworks that shape possibilities. Germany's defeat illustrates how systems that appear strong can harbor vulnerabilities that only become visible under sustained pressure. The enduring relevance of this analysis lies in its challenge to simplistic explanations. It invites a broader understanding of power as a composite of resources, institutions, and decision-making processes. When these elements are misaligned, even early success can accelerate eventual failure. By following this thread, the idea that Germany lost the war long before 1945 becomes less a provocative claim and more an analytical conclusion. The endpoint was visible in retrospect, embedded in choices made when victory still seemed attainable. The war's outcome was not predetermined, but once certain paths were chosen, alternatives narrowed steadily until collapse became unavoidable. In this sense, the history of Germany in World War II is not merely a story of defeat, but a study in how momentum can obscure reality. It demonstrates how confidence can delay reckoning, and how structural imbalance, left unaddressed, transforms challenge into inevitability. The final years of the war merely revealed what had been developing quietly beneath the surface from much earlier on.